Welcome everyone to this week's seminar. And before I introduce our speaker today, I will just mention some of the events that we've got coming up in the next couple of weeks. We've got quite a few double doses of seminars. So next Thursday we've got Tom Crowther from ETH Zurich talking about global ecological shift for the protection and restoration of biodiversity. So that's Thursday at 5 o'clock. Here, not the usual slot. And then on Friday, we've got Hugh Possingham on Does Science Impact Nature Conservation Policy? Stories of Success and Failure, and used at a variety of roles, including being Chief Scientist at Nature Conservancy and being one of the leading thinkers in designing conservation strategies. And then the following week, we've got Justin Adams on the 10th of May on boldly reimagining our approaches for nature recovery, which will look at his transition from finance, being a nature finance person, to thinking actually we need something far more systemic to deal with nature recovery. So it's Justin's road to epiphany with that talk. And then the week after, we've got Philip Antwer Ajay on climate change and rural livelihoods in Ghana. And the week after, we've got Amy Dickman from Wild Crew on wildlife warriors and women, large carnivore conservation in Tanzania. So we've got quite an interesting range of talks coming up. So do that as some come to those. Then today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Forrest Fleischman, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota, where he researches forest and environmental policy and governance. And his work examines the interaction of scientific knowledge, government expertise, and civil engagement in policy making and implementation, as well as the outcomes of the resulting policies. In addition to working in Minnesota, he also does a lot of work in India and in Mexico. And I think Forrest first appeared in my awareness for some of his commentaries on the problematic and outcomes of forest restoration policies in India, and to what extent that actually succeeded, and how social engagement or lack of social engagement was part of the problems of that. So we're really here some of that here as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's fun to be here in Oxford, and I think it's particularly fun that the next speaker here is going to be Tom Crowther, because I've published some stuff criticizing his work, so you'll get to hear.
Statistically, that was going to be way
that was 5 years ago, so I'm sure he is probably taken into account some of the criticism and will present something new, but I thought that was fun when I saw that on the calendar. Today's talk is called Restoration Social Science, a Research Agenda. So I'm on sabbatical right now. I've been in Barcelona for 9 months at I was going to give the English translation, the Catalan Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, also known as ICTA, at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. And this is what I've been working on, is sort of thinking about what's next. And so I've done a lot of research, and I'll present some of my past research in this talk, but I'm framing it as a forward-looking agenda for future research. And actually, just in the hour or so before this, I submitted a pre-proposal for a grant that would support some of the kind of research that I'm proposing here. So let's see. There we go. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to define the main ideas of what I'm calling restoration social science, and sort of present a set of questions that I think are the core questions that the social science of restoration needs to address. And I'm going to examine a case study from India, which explains both how I got to this and also illustrates some of the challenges. So I've designed this talk in part with students in mind, and you say, how do you get to be an associate professor who's giving a talk that says research agenda? And so we'll backpedal about 15 years to when I was an early doctoral student and seeing some things I didn't expect to see and how that got me here. And then in the concluding section of the talk, I will talk about some sort of broader implications of the work and maybe offer some preliminary suggestions that might be answers to some of the questions I'm going to pose. The main ideas of this talk are that restoration is a major new force reshaping the relationship between people and nature. Restoration itself is not new, but the scale at which it's being proposed and planned is much larger than in the past. And second, historically, restoration has been understood primarily as something that ecologists do or that people trained in ecology do. But I'm going to argue that the human dynamics of restoration are of equal or possibly greater importance to ecosystems. So if we want to do restoration on this really big scale, we need to be thinking a lot about people. There's not much social science research about this topic. And furthermore, as I've been thinking about this, I have come to the realization that thinking about restoration social science really requires us to rethink a lot of the ways that traditionally people's creative capacities and their relationship to nature work. But at the same time, I think we can draw on a lot of past research on related topics in the social sciences. And I will come back to that idea. So many people in the audience may be already aware of what I'm going to say on this slide, but carbon storage, landscape restoration has sort of emerged as the latest global conservation fad. When I talk about global conservation fads, I was remembering today that I came to Oxford once before, and that was in 2008. And I was coming to attend the International Association for the Study of the Commons, which was held in Cheltenham. And I came to Oxford first because I had a friend who was doing a postdoc here. And at that conference in Cheltenham, there was a whole series of panels about forestry decentralization, which was the thing everyone was talking about back in 2008. And Arun Agrawal came to one of those panels and he said, you know, guys, there's this new thing called reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. I think we should all be paying attention to it. 5 or 6 years later at the same conference, there were no panels about forest decentralization. No one was doing forest decentralization anymore. No one was studying forestry decentralization anymore. And everyone was studying REDD+. So Arun was right. And now sort of interest in REDD+ seems to be waning. And now the new thing is all this carbon storage and forest restoration. So we have a UN decade on forest restoration, or an ecosystem restoration, excuse me. There's a Bonn challenge, which aims to restore 350 million hectares of degraded and deforested land by 2030. This is a really large amount of land. There's also 3 different trillion trees initiatives that all aim to plant 1 trillion trees. And that's where my disagreement with Tom Crowther is, because he wrote a paper saying that 1 trillion trees was a good number. And I was a contributor to a paper that said that we didn't think that was a good number. And there's a variety of other agreements and initiatives at international, national, and subnational scales that are all talking about restoration, much of it focused specifically on forests. I didn't put up the UK initiatives, but I know there's a lot of initiatives here. There's a lot of initiatives in the EU. I'm in Spain. There's a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of initiatives towards restoration in the US right now. So the Society for Ecological Restoration defines ecological restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. It is distinct from restoration ecology, which is the science that supports the practice of ecological restoration, and from other forms of environmental repair, in seeking to assist recovery of native ecosystems and ecosystem integrity. Ecological restoration aims to move a degraded ecosystem to a trajectory of recovery that allows adaptation to local and global changes, as well as persistence and evolution of its component species. So this is a nice definition. I have a problem with it, and the problem is in red. So the problem is in red in this slide. They say that restoration ecology is the science that supports the practice of ecological restoration. So right away, I think that something is missing. It's the people. So restoration ecology is an ecological science. It's not primarily a science that pays attention to what people are doing It's a science that pays attention to what ecosystems are doing. Obviously, if you want to repair an ecosystem, you need to pay attention to what the ecosystem is doing. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do restoration ecology, and I'm not here to critique restoration ecology, but to say we're missing something in this definition. What we're missing is, first of all, what degraded, damaged, or destroyed the ecosystem. I mean, sometimes we do restoration ecology in the context of a post-hurricane or after a volcano or something like that. But most of the time, we're doing restoration ecology because people have changed a landscape and we want to undo those changes. Furthermore, when we talk about repairing something, we're very explicitly talking about people taking actions to do things. So if we want to have a science of how we do restoration, we need to pay attention to what caused the problem and how are we going to repair it. And those are social scientific questions, not ecological questions. So we can understand restoration as a process of changing human behavior from behaviors that degrade, damage, or destroy an ecosystem to one that repair or create a new ecosystem. And if we understand it that way, we see that, okay, we might need to understand the ecological dynamics of what to do to repair or create, but the changing human behavior might be the really central aspect of ecosystem restoration. And just to give you evidence that this is not what restoration ecology is, because sometimes people will say, well, restoration ecology can include the human element. So we looked at the journal Restoration Ecology, and that is the flagship journal of the Society for Ecological Restoration. And we found that only 9% of the papers published in the last decade either used social science research techniques. So we defined using social science as like, what did they interview people, or did they do a focus group or something like that? So only 9% of the papers either did that or engaged with local, traditional, or indigenous knowledge. So actually there's about 5 or 6% of the papers that engaged with social science, because that includes papers that may have not been engaged with social science, but were using in some way traditional ecological knowledge. So this is not a major focus in the discipline of restoration ecology. That's a paper that is part of a student's dissertation that will be defended in May. So hopefully we'll get that paper submitted very soon. So the key questions that I think that a restoration social science should be trying to answer are, first of all, what is restoration in theory and in practice? And the practice is very important because I think a lot of the debate that's been in the journals about these big restoration goals is abstracted away from what people actually do on the landscape when they say they're doing restoration. And one of the things we'll see in India is the things that India as a country has done in the name of restoration are not really like what restoration ecologists are publishing about in the journal Restoration Ecology. And I've heard from people working in other landscapes that that's true elsewhere. Second, why does restoration happen? Why are people doing it? Third, how do people contribute to the outcomes of restoration? What is it about human behavior that makes a restoration project successful or unsuccessful? Again, the restoration ecology questions have often been like, what trees should we plant? Or how densely should we plant trees? But the social science question is, what are people doing to make those trees planted survive or grow? Another question is, how does restoration affect people? There's been a widespread assumption that there's sort of a win-win outcome to restoration. Restoration is good for people and nature. But as you'll see, that's often not the case. There's a lot of trade-offs involved. And a last question for the social scientists is restoration social science a distinct thing? Or do we already have conservation science, political ecology, land system science, which are addressing very similar topics, and we can just apply them to this slightly different context of restoration? So I want to talk about how I got here. I did not set out to be a restoration social scientist. I did my PhD in public policy, and I was really interested in forest management. So I was really interested in how do government officials implement forest policy? So I was working in India at the time, and I decided that my doctoral dissertation was going to be basically an ethnography of government officials and how they carried out forest policies. And so I went and followed government officials around in central India as they did stuff, forest officials. And this guy, let's see if I can get my, oops, see if I can get my cursor back. Okay. This guy right here in the green shirt in the middle of that picture was one of the people I was studying. I was following him around for a couple of weeks. He was a very nice older gentleman who was a forest official in central India. He said, well, while you're here, I'd like to take you to see something really special. I'm going to take you to see this population of blackbuck antelope that we have. Blackbuck are pretty rare, but we have a remnant population here. So we went there, and at dusk, we saw these antelope, very pretty antelope jumping around. I'm not a wildlife photographer, so that's not my picture. I just downloaded it from somewhere. And I got back to my room, and I dug out my copy of Prater's Guide to Indian Mammals, which is, at that time, was the only reference I knew about Indian mammals. And like, what are these antelope I just saw? And I read blackbuck used to occur in practically all the plains areas, except the Indian coast southward from blah, blah, blah. They avoid forest or hill tracks. So I asked this guy, well, you have this kind of rare animal that you're responsible for managing. What are you going to do to manage for them? He said, oh, well, we're planning to put some tree plantations in these grasslands to help the blackbuck. I was like, what's going on here? Something weird is going on. And in fact, the other thing I did was I went around, I was really interested in the implementation of something called joint forest management, which was supposedly the government was going to work with local communities to manage the forest. And I'd go to these government officials, I'd be like, take me to see joint forest management. I want to know what that's about. And they would always take me to a tree plantation. And I was like, I thought this was a program about working with local people. What's up with these tree plantations? So I realized that something interesting was going on. It wasn't what I had come there to study. And what was going on was something weird with regards to tree planting in India. That didn't make sense to me. So I finished my PhD dissertation. I wrote a paper about how it was weird that government officials wanted to plant trees everywhere, even though oftentimes it didn't make much sense. And a few years later, I was very fortunate to get an NSF grant, a NASA grant to study what was going on with the tree plantations at a much larger scale. And for a variety of reasons, I shifted from central India to the Himalayan foothills. And I went to this landscape, the Kangra district of Himachal Pradesh. And as you can see, in the foreground, you got these rolling hills covered with pine and oak forests. And in the background, you've got the Daladar Range, which is part of the Lesser Himalaya, because it's only 18,000 feet tall. So behind them, there's a valley, and then there's like the real Himalaya, which are much taller. So we looked at the tree plantations in this area, and this was a good place to look because in Himachal Pradesh, they've been planting a lot of trees for a long time. And as you can see in this figure, the peak years for planting trees in Himachal Pradesh were the 1980s and 1990s, and this suited our purposes perfectly because this meant the trees were big enough that we ought to be able to see them now in a satellite photo. So one of the problems with evaluating something like a restoration program or a tree planting program specifically is it takes a long time for the trees to grow. So if you go there 5 years later, like, hey, this didn't work, the trees aren't very big. Well, yeah, they're trees. But a 20-year-old tree or a 40-year-old tree, you should be able to see. Landsat has imagery going back to the early 1980s in this region. And the other thing that's important to know is why were they planting trees in this area? And they were planting trees in this area, they said, because the Himalayas are really important for the water supply of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. We want to conserve the water supply by making sure there's good forest cover in the Himalayas. So this wasn't, we're planting timber to grow a commercial crop. This was, we're doing ecological restoration. We're trying to restore and manage the Himalayan forests. So as a detour, but this is relevant, restoration means changing land cover. This means changing what the land produces. And it also might mean changing who has the rights to that land. And it means changing who benefits from the land. So I'll explain why this is relevant in this landscape in a second. In these pictures that you see, these are pictures I took in central India, and they are restoring this area, they say, by bulldozing it. Why do they need to bulldoze it? Because the scrub forest that they're bulldozing is all stump sprouting species. So if they just cut it down, they all sprout up again. And what they want to do to restore it is plant a eucalyptus plantation. So they need no competition from all these stump sprouting native trees. So hence the bulldozer. They're going to dig out the roots of all these trees, and then they're going to plant a nice eucalyptus plantation. And they have a good reason for doing this, by the way. They say, these scrubby forests aren't worth anything to the local people. This is what the government said. But a eucalyptus plantation will produce a commercially saleable crop in 7 years. And they can sell this crop, and then the local people will see that they can make money off of forestry. And then they'll be able to sell trees again 5 years later, 5 years later, 5 years later, and they'll make money, and then they'll value the forests, and they'll work to conserve them. Today's restoration agenda is a product of big NGOs, international agencies, governments, and scientists. It's not being designed by local people. They claim that this is joint forest management, but the reality is they didn't ask any of these people, hey, do you want to bulldoze this and have a eucalyptus plantation? They just decided that that's how they were going to do it. And will this translate into benefits for local people? Maybe or maybe not. I think the history of these sort of top-down agendas is often not. They often don't work. In the landscape that we worked in the Himalayas, again, not the landscape where those bulldozers were. They only plant native trees here. So they don't plant any eucalyptus. They planted eucalyptus a long time ago there. They've realized it didn't work well for their purposes, and they stopped. So that's good. But tree plantations are still problematic for some people, and in particular for these Gadi pastoralists. Gadis are essentially an indigenous group to the Himalayas. They're traditionally herd sheep and goats from the alpine pastures down into the plains of India with the seasons. And they actually live and have farms. So they're an interesting pastoral group. Sometimes you hear about pastoral groups just being pastoral, but the Gadis have farms. And they have farms right in the elevations that we were studying. So in some of the villages we studied were largely Gadis. And they don't like these plantations. Why don't they like the plantations? First of all, sheep and goats like to eat grass, shrubby things. They don't like to eat tall trees. So plantations are a problem for the sheep and goats. The plantations are also set up, they put a barbed wire fence around them. And this is the Himalayas. There's really steep mountains. Sometimes there's like only one way to go up. And if someone puts a fence around it, then you can't go. So that it becomes a big problem. So they don't like the plantations. They're a problem from them. On the other hand, we actually found that a lot of the Gadis were doing pretty well. So this is a complicated story. It's not that the Gadis got these plantations and now their lives are destroyed. It's more that the Gadis are sort of going through a classic modernization. They've gotten access to education. The state has a really good educational system, at least in the context of India. So their kids go to school, they get jobs. Gadis are listed as a scheduled tribe. So for those of you who are familiar with India, that means they get some preference in hiring for government jobs, some preference in educational opportunities. And so a lot of the Gadis are moving away from sheep herding. The ones who are still sheep herding are benefiting. The wool isn't worth much anymore, but meat prices have gone up a lot. So they're actually doing okay also, the ones who are still herding. So the tree plantations are bad for them, but it's not like a total disaster for their way of life. So the next thing we looked at is what actually happens on these sites where there's a plantation. And what I have here, this is actually from the supplementary information of one of our papers. So I think no one's ever seen this, but I'm putting it up because I think it's helpful to understand what's going on here. These are individual plantations that we mapped and then looked at time slices of Landsat data for the land cover. And what you're seeing is the percent forest canopy cover in each plantation site. So the first plantation, let's see if I can get my cursor back. Okay, the first plantation here, tree cover was pretty high, started to decline after there was trees planted in it. So the dotted line is when the trees were planted. Second plantation, unfortunately, isn't a great example because the planting happened before we had Landsat data. Tree cover declined and then it increased. Doesn't seem to have anything to do with planting. The third one over here, this is a pretty good story, maybe. Looks like probably between this dot and this dot, tree plant cover declined, but then after the plantation, it increased. In this one, decline after plantation. This one, decline after plantation. This one, we see a big increase after plantation. So you see there's a lot of different patterns. On the next slide, we will see the average pattern. So the top graph here is the red line in the center is the year the plantation was put in. And you can see there's no effect. On average, there's no effect of tree planting on canopy cover. So that's pretty bad. We'd expect there to be an effect, right? You plant a bunch of trees, they might grow and then increase canopy cover. So people ask me, does this mean the trees died? We don't know. If you go back to this slide, maybe it was like the one on the top where the canopy cover was already really high beforehand, so there was nowhere to go. For some of them, that might be the case, but this is the average effect. But on the bottom graph, you can see that the percent area classified as broadleaf declined after plantation. This is not a surprise because we have data that show that the most commonly planted trees are Pinus roxburghii, a native pine, and Cedrus deodari, a native cedar. So you plant a lot of needle-leaf trees, you get less broadleaf trees. This is kind of bad because it turns out that for biodiversity, the broadleaf trees seem to harbor more biodiversity in this landscape. And for local livelihood needs, it seems like the broadleaf trees in general are more useful. They make better firewood. They're better fodder for animals. Those are the two biggest uses of the forest. For medicinal plants, it seems like more of them grow in the broadleaf forest than in the pine forest in particular. The pine forests are more fire prone and are associated, but local people tell us that they lead to plant invasions by invasive plants. So the effect is like pretty bad. But, and this isn't a paper that's under review, you saw that in some villages, tree cover increased. And some it decreased. So we did another analysis, which, as I say, we haven't published yet. Why did it increase in some villages and not in others? So our publication says the average effect is 0, but this is a new paper that no one has seen yet. And what you see here is that there is one variable in particular called continuous participation. And plantations that have continuous participation show a significant increase in canopy cover after 20 years, and that remains significant up to 40 years. So what's continuous participation mean? At a very simple operational level, we asked 2 questions in every plantation. We asked, were local people involved in planning this plantation? About 2/3 of the plantations, we found that to be the case. Are local people still involved today in managing the plantation? That was about 1/3. So we said that's continuous participation. So if local people were involved in planning and are still involved today, we don't know if they were really involved every day in the interim, but probably if they're still involved today, they probably were involved all the way through. So one of the reasons that a lot of these plantations fail is they're targeted to the wrong places. And in fact, maybe there's just not that many good places left to plant. So this is a separate data set. Between 2016 and 2019, we had the locations of all the plantations in the whole state, not just in this one little district. And we found that almost 40% of the plantations were in areas where there was already dense tree cover. Now, there could be a good reason to do that. Maybe they're trying to diversify an old stand of pines with some broadleaf trees, for example. So I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not going to increase forest cover, just going to change the composition. Anecdotally, we hear actually a lot of it is just like they have a target, they need to plant so many trees. So, okay, well, this is land that the forest department owns, let's plant some trees here. 50% almost were in non-forest areas. Again, that could mean we're reforesting areas, or it could mean we're planting trees where trees don't grow. And in fact, some of these non-forest areas are places like steep south-facing slopes, where trees might struggle to grow, or if you know the landscape in Ladakh, which is 4,000 meters in the rain shadow of the Himalayas. It's a high altitude alpine desert, and they're planting trees there. So that's not really a good place to plant trees. And we did some modeling. We found that most of the trees were being planted in areas where our model predicted that trees wouldn't grow. And most of the tree species that are planted, even though they say it's all for restoration, are these traditionally commercial timber species like the pine that are not really useful to local people. So there's really a disconnect between what the government says they're doing, which is like restoring tree cover in the Himalayas to benefit watersheds, and what this program is actually achieving, which is probably making things worse if not doing anything. Foresters, we found, really kind of believe in the value of planting trees. They think it's their goal to make all of India forested, or not all of, but all the forest areas forested. There's increasing evidence that a lot of these areas are probably naturally savannas and probably shouldn't have dense forests in them. So this is maybe just not a good program, not a good way of thinking about it, but there's this very strong target-driven approach. We need to plant so many trees per year. We're going to get more funding to plant more trees. And there's been very little evaluation of these programs done. Ours is one of the first papers that have even evaluated them. There's also a failure to think about what's driving forest loss and what might lead to forest regrowth. So in this paper that I really like, Ruth de Vries's group showed that when you provide alternative energy sources in central India, forests regrow. When people need less firewood, they harvest less firewood and the trees grow back. Now, this won't work everywhere in India. In the Himalayas, where I've been working, people harvest a lot of firewood for home heating because it's cold in the winter. And a gas cooking stove isn't for warming your house, it's only for cooking. But in central India, which is much warmer, this seems to be very effective. I mentioned that not all these places are really naturally dense forests. So why are we trying to make them that? It's not really clear why we're trying. Well, it is clear. There's a department that's been built around the idea of India being a place with dense forests, but it's not clear that that's really a good thing. There's kind of a failure to address what some of the real threats to forests in India are, which are invasive plants. In the foreground of this lower picture, you can see some pretty flowers. Those are lantana. They're a horrible invasive that takes over and destroys everything. They're from Central America. And there's also a failure to think about agroforestry as a key part of the solution. And work that people here have been involved in and that I've been involved in have both pointed to the great potential that India has for increasing agroforestry. Although I also think it's important to think about potential trade-offs between what we think of a forest as providing and what an agroforestry is providing. An agroforestry system might have less carbon than a natural forest, for example, but a lot more carbon than a rice paddy. An agroforestry system will have some biodiversity, but it'll be a different biodiversity than a natural forest. But they might provide a lot more benefits to people in a landscape which is really dense and heavily used. So I'm going to cycle back to the last away from India and up back to these big questions I posed that I hope my case study has provided some motivation. What is restoration? I think of restoration as being a process of reconfiguring relationships between people and nature in ways that some people believe will assist the recovery of some aspect of an ecosystem, which they see as degraded, damaged, or destroyed. As we see in the Indian case, this can be quite complicated and controversial. The government thinks they need more trees to secure water supplies. There's not good evidence for that. There's now a bunch of ecologists saying these places have never had dense forests. We should be managing them as savannas. We should maybe be managing them for that black buck antelope. Maybe we should be managing them for livelihood benefits rather. So these are all value judgments about what we want out of an ecosystem. And we can reconfigure the Indian landscape in multiple ways in different places to achieve these different goals. So thinking about this means, yes, we certainly need to know about ecosystem processes and histories to understand restoration. But we also need to really understand the human activities that are influencing and causing change in the ecosystems. And we need to really think about value-based claims about what an ecosystem should be like and who should be benefiting from it. Should we be aiming to store more carbon in India? So because wealthy people in India and in the UK and in the US are emitting carbon? Or should we be prioritizing local livelihood needs for the poor people who live in rural India and are some of the people who are most threatened by climate change? Second thing, the restoration that's studied and practiced by academic restoration ecologists often looks really different from what is being done in the name of these big global pledges. So India signed on to all these big global pledges. Hey, yeah, we know how to plant trees. But that's, I mean, I've given an earlier version of this talk to some restoration ecologists, and they were just like, what you're talking about isn't restoration. No restoration ecologist would have signed off on that. Well, yeah, but India says they're doing this big restoration thing, and that's what they're doing. And I can tell you, in Mexico, I haven't done as rigorous research in Mexico, there's a huge restoration program that's probably even worse than this. So in practice, restoration is often simply reorganizing things that people have already been doing. So I said, when they said they were doing joint forest management, they just were planting trees. And now they say they're doing restoration, they're just planting trees. And, you know, before that, they said that they were doing social forestry. That was a big thing in the 1980s in India. They were just planting trees. So they know how to plant trees, and they can kind of, whatever the global development discourse is about, okay, we can do that. Yes, plant trees, plant trees, plant trees. So I think we need more documentation about what's being done in the name of these practices in different places. And I think that's a really big empirical question that isn't being very widely addressed, at least that I've seen. So why does restoration happen? Well, restoration could be happening because it's really a way towards a more just, verdant, and peaceful future. But it might be a way that people are using to claim land rights. And in fact, forest officials in India have told me, we're planting trees here because we want the farmers to know it's our land. We're the forest department. If there's no trees here, how do people know it's a forest? Well, if there's trees here, it's obviously belongs to us, right? So I think we could come up with UK examples of a similar sort of thing, where we're doing restoration as a way to claim control over land. And it could also be that we're privileging certain values about nature over other values in nature when we do restoration. So when we talk about planting trees in landscapes used by pastoralists, we're saying we want this landscape to be used for whatever the trees are producing, rather than to benefit the livelihoods of these pastoral people. And finally, I think a big reason why restoration has become popular is it's a way to greenwash environmentally destructive activities. Hey, we can keep emitting carbon, and I've had people tell me this, we just need to restore nature and it will take care of itself. Okay, this is what the next slide says. So I kind of already said everything on this slide. So restoration is getting big now. I think it's partly because restoration ecology has really matured as a discipline. I think it's partly because we have big problems that restoration can address. So I'm not devaluing that, but it's also partly part of this broader phenomenon of large-scale land grabbing and land transactions, and part of this broader phenomena of kind of trying to greenwash and avoid the responsibility we have to reduce carbon emissions and to deal with how the impact of our consumptive activities on biodiversity and other nature benefits. So how do people contribute to the outcomes of restoration? Well, as I said in the beginning, restoration is carried out by people. It depends on people changing their behavior and creating new patterns of land use, new patterns of living in the land. And human activities can often threaten restoration success. So as I showed in India, we're not getting trees growing after they're planted. And that's probably because whatever activities lead there to be not a lot of trees there are continuing after we plant the trees. So the classic example that's obvious in that system is people are grazing their goats there. We planted baby trees and put a barbed wire fence around them. And the person who needs to graze their goats there cut the barbed wire fence and brought their goats in, and they ate all the seedlings, right? So we didn't address the underlying conflict over what should this land be used for. We just planted trees. And that doesn't lead to tree growth because we didn't address the conflict. Same thing, burning is also a thing that happens a lot in that landscape I've been studying. So, you know, if people don't want those trees to grow or they want there to be grass there, they can burn it. And they can burn it at times when no one knows they're burning it, and it can just look like an accident. Someone dropped a cigarette there in the evening and it burns. So there's a great book, if you're interested in this, by Rebecca Lave and I don't remember his first name, Doyle, called Streams of Revenue, that looks at stream restoration in the United States and shows that stream restoration in the United States often leads to bad streams. And you can read the book if you're interested in why. So this social science view leads to a reconceptualization of what restoration is. It's not necessarily about consciously manipulating plants and animals to get an outcome. It's about broader changes in land use patterns. So if we actually look at big changes in forest cover, positive changes in forest cover in the world, we can look at most of Europe and most of Eastern North America, which had these dramatic increases in forest cover in the 20th century. And it wasn't because someone went out and restored the forest. It was because there was an energy transition away from wood fuel use, and there was large-scale abandonment of marginal farmland in favor of people moving to industrializing cities. And actually, we see similar patterns in places like the Himalayas. Nepal is a great example where outmigration has led to tree regrowth. So if we want to restore forests, maybe we don't need to be thinking about planting trees or, you know, assisted natural regeneration. Maybe we need to think about what are people doing on this landscape and how could we make their lives better in ways that might also be good for forests. And I'm not saying that we should depopulate the countryside. I'm just saying that that's an example of something that's happened in the past that is actually restoration, but is not fit into the restoration paradigm. How does restoration impact people? There's a lot of assumptions that they're win-win outcomes. Our cases found some modest negative impacts and some modest positive impacts. There's some case studies from elsewhere in India that have found very negative impacts. I think that restoration is likely to be beneficial to many people and also likely to be harmful to many people because it involves changing land use. If we look at big restoration plans, we can look at this paper that Bernardo Strasberg et al. Wrote a few years ago, one of my favorite papers. And we can look at how much of the world they think should be a priority for restoration based on their models. And we find out, we did this in a follow-up paper, and we found that they were targeting almost 97% of the agricultural land in the Philippines as a high priority for restoration. And I'll just say that that's never going to happen. So I don't really know why we're talking about it, other than to point out that when we think about these big picture images of what restoration can be, we need to actually think about what's going on in the land there. Lots of relatively poor smallholders in these landscapes making a living off of these landscapes. And if we think that all needs to be restored, we either need to rethink what it means, what restoration means, or we need to rethink where restoration, maybe restoration should occur in the United States, but it's not a priority because US forests, US lands that are not forests don't have gigantic carbon and biodiversity potentials, which is what they were primarily looking at. So if we look at where people will be impacted by restoration, we can look at, this is the map, by the way, that those numbers came off of. This is the visual interpretation of that. And you can see, I think that the Philippines are pretty light green color. A lot of Southeast Asia is in this light green high restoration priority color. So I am working with people at the Nature Conservancy. They approached me. They said, you've been a critic of all these past global maps. Can you help us make a better one? And I kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit. And I said, well, people do look at these maps, so I'll try to help you make it better. So first of all, there's 5 global restoration priority maps that have been produced, and they don't overlap very much, which is kind of weird. They use different data and they end up with very different priorities. So this paper is close to being submitted. Second thing I said is, okay, what if we only put restoration in places, what if we make a map of where are the places that we know we can restore? That means we don't think they might be savannas. We don't think that there are places where there's dictatorial governments or a weak land tenure, so restoration will be done in places where land rights won't be respected. And we ended up, this is the most conservative scenario that we ran, but we ended up with this map on the lower part of the slide, where we found that basically you can restore lands in the arc of deforestation in the Amazon and in eastern US. And those are the only places that look this good for restoration. And actually, overall, we found that the global potential for restoration is probably a lot less than in these more ambitious maps, once you start really looking at all the limitations of land tenure, of different ecosystem types, et cetera. So this paper will be exciting when it comes out. We haven't submitted it yet, but I've reviewed a final ready to be submitted draft. So I think it'll be submitted soon and hopefully be out in a year or so. All right, I'm almost done. I posed the question, how is restoration social science distinct from related fields at the beginning? And we talked about this a little bit about lunch. Maybe we're just restating the things that political ecologists and land system scientists have been saying for decades about, or development economists for that matter, about development programs. And we're just restating it in a new context. Most of the things I've said, I could have said about the forestry decentralization programs that were popular in the late 1990s and early 2000s that we were talking about the last time I was in this part of the world, almost 16 years ago. The land use transitions that are referred to in Europe and North America and the Himalayas and various other areas are very well studied by these other research traditions. I do think that there's something distinctive about restoration, which is restoration is envisioned as an act of creation by people. And I think that this is insufficiently captured in the restoration ecology literature because they're too focused on making the ecosystem be like some past ecosystem, but they're creating a new ecosystem when they do it. It's never going to be exactly like the past. It's a creative act. Even if their eventually goal is to get something like the past, you have to do these human creation aspect to get there. And I think the centering of humans as creative agents is not the way we've traditionally thought about the environment. All these traditions tend to see the humans as sort of the destructive agent in ecosystems, but restoration re-envisions people as creative agents. I think that's kind of exciting. I've been doing some work in urban ecology and I'm doing the urban governance side of urban ecology in Minnesota where I live. And it's interesting because the urban ecologists are like, yeah, we're studying these ecosystems that people created. We're studying a park. It was all created by people. That's what restoration is also. So it's been an interesting dialogue for me, and I think it's a new way for me to think about it. And when I really get down to it and think about all nature in the Anthropocene, all nature is somehow created by people. Even the protected area that's very remote and undisturbed, it's a decision by people that made it a protected area. So I think that re-envisioning restoration ecology has also helped me re-envision what human-environment relationships are. And human-environment relationships are very much about creating things, including creating wildernesses, creating protected areas. Why don't we already have restoration social science? There are people studying this. I'm not the only person out there. I haven't found a lot of sort of coherent theory, except for, I would say, Rebecca Leib's really excellent work on stream restoration in the US, maybe as an exception. Part of this is that the large-scale nature of restoration is new. And I mean, really, I got attracted to it because I saw there's this new thing that's going on, and we need to work on it. But I think it's time for social scientists to really step up and start looking at this more, because there's a lot of it going on around the world, and we need to understand it. So I don't say this all as a criticism of ecologists. I say it as a criticism of social scientists, that we social scientists need to pay attention to what's going on here. So I know there's a Nature-Based Solution Institute that some of you are a part of. So restoration is really prominent in nature-based solutions. And I just wanted to put in this slide where thinking of this way about restoration has caused me to question the nature-based solutions framing, because I think saying it's a nature-based solution decenters this role of human creative agency. And I think, not necessarily in the research community, but in the practice community, there's a tendency to be like, oh, we can just let nature fix itself. And nature doesn't fix itself in that way. It's people, often poor rural people in developing countries, who are changing the way they work. And that's often what we think of as a nature-based solution. So it's a challenge, because I think the nature-based solution framing is very charismatic, for lack of a better word, and restoration is a big part of it. But I want to challenge those of you working on that area to really be explicit about who are the people doing it and what's their creative agency in doing it. As my last slide, I think restoration social science needs to be pursued in partnership with restoration ecologists. Again, I'm giving this talk not as a critique of restoration ecologists, but as a call for more interdisciplinary engagement. One of the things I've heard a few times when I've had this discussion is some restoration ecologists said, well, I've tried to work with social scientists, and man, they're hard to work with. And it just doesn't work. I think it just takes a long time to build these relationships. So I think that this can't be, oh yeah, tomorrow we're going to start a project. It has to be about building relationships and working together over long time frames. We've been working in this landscape in the Himalayas since 2017. We've yet to do any good ecological research. I think we're getting close to doing it. We had one project that got screwed up by COVID, so we would have had it earlier, but it's hard. I think the second thing is we really need to be documenting what's being done in the name of these big global restoration successes, and pay attention to how both the interaction of landscape and cultural diversity. And I just want to, on the last slide, list the names of a bunch of people who I've worked very closely with, some of them for quite a long time, and have really shaped my thinking about this topic and co-authored a lot of this work with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I think many of your comments about working in partnership across the ecological and social sciences will hopefully resonate with a lot of people here, I think. So we can open up to questions from the floor. Does anybody want to kick off? Maybe. This is just for the online audience. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I have one question. Is there a sort of tension between science and this idea that we include people in these decisions. Science often has a sort of top-down approach of we go there, we test something, we look at what's happening. But actually what we would have to do if we did this properly, we would first need to go there and just ask and have a sort of democratic process of what can we actually sort of in a dialogue come to a conclusion what's best for everyone. But often that's not really how science, I mean, ideally maybe would be, but I imagine it's quite difficult to write grants that way and so forth. So do you have any ideas of how this could be implemented at a sort of broader scale to involve people from the beginning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I just submitted this afternoon before this talk a grant pre-proposal, which is addressing this exact question. So first of all, I don't think the tension is with science. I think the tension is with funders. I think funders, not just science funders, but project funders in general, sort of want you to have a plan. And what I'm saying is, well, first you need to go and ask the people, but how are you going to do that if you don't have money to go and ask them? So what I'm proposing to the U.S. National Science Foundation, they have a planning grant to plan a future research project. So I said, I want to go to these 3 places where we want to work and run workshops where we identify what the research questions are about restoration. Within the broader framework of restoration as this sort of creative transformation that should ideally be beneficial to people in nature. So I'm doing that because I think that's the right thing to do. But I also think that there can be different roles. And so, for example, a restoration ecologist can go and run an experiment to see what's the best way to restore this ecosystem. And you don't have to talk to people first. You just figure out what's the best way to do it. And then you can offer that to people. Hey, if you want to do this, here's how to do it best. And I don't think that is not a wrong way to do science. It's not necessarily prioritizing local people, because maybe then you go to the local people and they say, oh, that's not the outcome we wanted. I think the problem is more serious in the practice world, because in the practice world, they go out, they write the proposal, and then they go out and muck around with things. And then maybe what they mucked around with wasn't what the people wanted. And that's a more serious concern. So I think that there needs to be some pushback to funders. And there is some shifting in the funding world, because this NSF call for proposals said, we want community engaged research projects. So that's why I feel comfortable saying, hey, I'm going to go out and talk to the people and decide what the research questions are, because that's actually what they basically said they wanted. So I don't know if other funding agencies are doing that, but I think there's ways to do that. And I guess the other piece I would say is most scientists have long careers. So if we think about it as a project, it's hard to do it. But if we think about, well, I might be going back to this system or place where I'm working for a 10-year period over multiple projects, then you start to get, well, while I'm doing the first project, I can be asking questions about what the next project is. And then we can start designing projects that respond to, so the graph I showed you where we showed that continuous participation is important. When we saw that, we wrote, and actually, even though we haven't published the paper, we got a grant to study, well, what does this look like? What does this mean? How did we get continuous participation in these communities? Why didn't it exist in others? So that's a big part of the scientific process. But I think it means thinking a little bit bigger about what our science is beyond sort of the project cycle.
I'll ask the question. I was just reflecting on and it's part of the challenge in some of the examples you gave about what the goals are. So your first example in India was essentially driven by, well, essentially is a Ministry of Forest Creation,
Right.
that their purpose in life is to create forests.
Yeah.
No other purpose but forests are inherently a good thing. And then later on, the examples are essentially NGOs or businesses of carbon accumulation. Their purpose is to accumulate carbon. And none of those, I think, an ecologist would say neither of those are actually ecological restoration.
Right.
They're perverse goals that are being imposed on ecosystems that sometimes get have the label of restoration attached to them.
Yeah.
So it is part of the challenge that where too much is being brought into or the wrong targets are being brought into what we could call social ecological restoration or
Yeah.
ecological restoration.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's the case. And I think that's why I said a few times in the talk, like, we need to study what's being done, because I've talked to a lot of restoration ecologists who are like, yeah, the stuff that you're describing, that's not restoration. Like, we wouldn't do that. And, you know, dense plantations of trees is not a cost-effective way to restore forest cover. And there's lots of research showing that. But that's what's being done. And so I think, yeah, there's these agendas being added on, and people are taking this sort of faddish thing about restoration being cool now and putting what they wanted to do anyway into it. And so I think from the ecological community, I'd like to see more critique of, like, hey, we saw this project and hey, this isn't really ecologically appropriate. I've seen some of that. So, and certainly in India, there's a bunch of people who I think several people here know, who have been saying, like, hey, these dense tree plantations, they don't make sense ecologically for a lot of these landscapes.
Okay, great. There's a question there.
Thanks, Forrest. Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. So I'd quite like to throw a few matches into the plantations of thinking here, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about how you're saying, oh, there needs to be a refocus on relationships between people and nature, and maybe between people and people as well. And what I was surprised by was that there was not so much talk of power in your talk. And I think that that could really benefit the social science agenda, is to bring in all those insights about power. And when I heard you talking here, it was about authority and about resistance as well. So I think there's loads that we could work on.
That's a very good point. Yeah, thank you.
And then the other thing was about interventionism, like just this kind of cycle of people doing things to other people, and how kind of broken that is, I think, especially in the cases that you showed. And I wondered if restoration, if it's kind of premised on that interventionism, then it's itself kind of already set up to fail almost, because it suggests that some people are making value judgments about other people's landscapes, that these are broken landscapes. And if I felt like people were coming into my landscape and saying this is a broken landscape that needs fixing, I would of course resist that idea, because I haven't grown up with those ideas. And then the final match I wanted to throw was that if restoration is about changing relationships, then I don't think the conservation industry or sector is really set up to focus on that, because that's not what it's done historically. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I agree with all your points. And I mean, I think in terms of power, I think I have the Ostrom student flaw of tending to talk more about institutions than about power relations. And sort of the power relations are kind of hiding behind the institutions in a lot of the work that I was trained in and the way I tend to talk about things. Whereas I think people trained more in political ecology have a tendency to sort of foreground the power struggle and maybe talk less about the sort of institutions. So I'll plead guilty to that flaw. And I think in terms of, and one of the things I think a lot about is no one would go and say to farmers in Minnesota, we need to restore your land to the prairie and forest that it once was. And if they did, they would, people in Minnesota tend to be polite. Their like Scandinavian ancestry comes out, but you know, you wouldn't get very far with that. So it's kind of ridiculous that people go and say that about the Philippines, and I think that it should be treated with the same amount of scorn, maybe. And then we need to rethink, well, what are we trying to do? And there could be a beneficial transformation. The prairies of America are gone, and it might be good to bring some of them back. But how would we go about doing that? We wouldn't go about doing that by making a global map of where to restore prairies. We'd go about doing that by figuring out a way to engage with landowners to change their management practices. And so then you said, well, the conservation organizations are often not well set up for that. And certainly the government forestry agencies are often not well set up for doing that. And I think that means we need to rethink how we create those, who and what those agencies and entities are. And there's a little bit of progress in that area. I mean, there do seem to be social scientists now working in some of these NGOs. That's maybe a step in the progress. But I think that, did you know Marcus Wangel in Uppsala? So he was a PhD student at Uppsala who I knew for some time. And he was studying the forest department in Kerala in South India. And it was very interesting to read his work because in Kerala, there's been this reorientation of government departments to serving local governments instead of government departments making decision-making. And he found that that actually happened, that, you know, that these government officials were actually saying, yeah, well, we need to do whatever forestry our local government has decided on. And so I think that there can be ways to re-envision. I mean, that state is very unusual in lots of ways and maybe isn't a great model in the sense that it has this very unique history. But I think we can be thinking about how to do that, and we can think about how these various big conservation NGOs might be able to work towards conservation, but in a more humble way, maybe. But it would require rethinking a lot of what they do, and even, unfortunately, whether they hire Oxford graduates. I mean, you know, maybe they need to be hiring people trained in the countries and fluent in the local cultures rather than people trained at elite institutions in the global north. I mean, that's bad for all of us who teach people in the global north, right? But yeah.
Oh, that's okay. You don't worry.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I wondered on a sort of practical note about when you talking about the people who are involved with the landscape. I noticed it came up in a bit in your work that there's a kind of mediation going on between like government officials and then the sort of local community. And how do you find out who your target audience is, and then how do you go about accessing and communicating with those people productively? And sort of because there's often maybe some kind of as an international researcher going in someone like India, there's sort of a government system or a local, maybe even below that, a sort of local structure where there's someone important in the village that wants to exclude their rivals. Like, how do you kind of negotiate that
as a researcher or as a
well, both? I mean, in your work,
you know, I think as a researcher, it's very hard and takes time. And I think a lot of researchers do it wrong. And in particular, what I've seen a lot of researchers do, including some of my own students who I've mentored, who go into another place that they're not from, and very few of us study where we're from. I mean, even students who are, say, from a global South country, students I've worked with in India, none of them are really from the communities they study. They're mostly urban elites who get educated, most of them, and then decide to go study. So my wife is Mexican. She works in Mexico, but she's from Mexico City. She'd like never seen a forest until she did her doctoral work. Well, never seen it, but she saw it from a car window or on a vacation. She never. So I think a lot of us go through these intermediary organizations. And I think that's really dangerous because the intermediary organizations often have their own axes to grind. So we go through a local university, we go through a local NGO, and that gets us access to these local communities. And I think that's often the only way to do it, but it's very dangerous because we go into those communities with the baggage of those groups, with the preconceptions of those groups coloring what we can know and do, and being seen as part of those groups And so I think it really takes time. I think we should be cultivating some independence from those kind of entities and trying to demonstrate that we're not part of them. And finding ways to question whatever, okay, the first person we talk to in the community, are they really representative of the community? Is the local leader, and in India, there's local elected leaders everywhere, but they often represent a particular faction. We need to go find those other factions. We need to be aware. And as a man in India, I know that I will not get much of the women's view. And in fact, in this research project, I said, I want to hire our field team to be 50% women. And we advertised. And do you know how many women applicants we got? 0. Because in that place, young women don't want to have a job where they have to go around, or their families don't want them to have a job where they're going around and asking strangers about their lives. So we got 0 applicants. So we couldn't do it. And that's a flaw in that research. So we don't know much about the women's perspective because the interviews were all done by men. So we need to be aware of those limitations. I think as practitioner organizations, I would want practitioner organizations to spend a lot of time in the field questioning what their role is and trying to figure out how to do their work better. And there's certain, I mean, in India, there's many organizations that do a great job of that. So it's not impossible to do. But they're often not the global NGOs, because the global NGOs are a little bit too top heavy and a little bit too Delhi centered. And they're often some of the more regional NGOs that are doing that really great work. And I think one way to think about it is finding the organizations that do that kind of work and finding ways to gradually allow them to grow their programs versus sort of reproducing the programs of the UK or US based big NGOs.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I want to follow up on the point about power, because really excellent point. And I think, yeah, good answer too. But and also as a bit of leading into that, when you say the problem is project funders, there are also scientific review committees that decide what gets funded.
Yeah.
And I think scientists are also part of the problem in terms of what is traditionally seen as a good proposal, with a clear sort of scientific innovation element, et cetera, and where is the room in there, even when it says in the description of the call that it must be community-based and everything that, is it actually, so I hope you get the grant, because I think that's a great approach, but along those lines too. So in thinking about the centrality of power, is it possible to really see the realization of a vision where these approaches to restoration are more locally driven without, at the same time, from a governance perspective, some serious transferring of power and rethinking, including how those projects are financed? Because you started your project off by talking, your talk off by talking about carbon as the new fad and kind of driving restoration. And there's a whole logic that comes along with that, a whole power dynamic, a whole sort of financial structure, et cetera.
Yeah.
So is there space in that logic to actually hand off decisions at a more local level, or do we have to see a more radical transformation of power in terms of who's making the decisions and about priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need some of that more radical transformation. And so if you remember the map, it's still up here. In this map, you can see that we sort of said, well, let's only restore in areas where we're sure that it won't harm people. And we ended up with this really small area. And I think that part of the answer is like, well, if there's a society in which we can't partner with organizations that are community-based and have a real sense that they can accomplish things, those are places we shouldn't be working to achieve some goals. And this is actually one paper I wrote much earlier in my career, before I was thinking about this, on conservation, looking with my wife and conservation in protected areas in the Mexico-Guatemala border. And we basically found that some things just don't work in Guatemala. And I mean, I hate to call Mexico a well-governed country, but there's some ways in which Mexico is much better governed and much more politically stable and has much better land rights, basically, than Guatemala. And so if given that you have the same forests on both sides of the border, you invest in Mexico. You don't invest in Guatemala because the land tenure conditions in Guatemala are really bad, and the land tenure conditions in southern Mexico, for all their other problems, are kind of decent. So, and you can scale that up and think, well, there might be landscapes in which we don't want to, I wouldn't give money to the Indian government for a restoration project based on what I've done, because I think they've demonstrated that they can't do it. But there might be other countries, I don't know, I've never studied, but Vietnam seems to have a lot of success stories. Maybe you could give money to Vietnam. I haven't read that literature very closely, so maybe I'm missing something. But I think that that's one way to think about it. And then I think the other thing is, historically, some of these organizations have taken a more conservation and funders have taken more radical stands, and it's mattered. Because one of the things I've heard a lot in India is government officials talk about the World Bank funded joint forest management projects as transformative. Because before the World Bank forced them to work with local people in order to get funding, they never did. Now, they still don't do a very good job of it, but they sort of do it. And it's because it's hard to call the World Bank radical, right? But the World Bank said this is the condition. And so I think that there can be progress made by putting those conditionalities on projects and by being really explicit about what you need, that can slowly reconfigure power.
Point to end on. So thank you, Forrest, for your presentation. Lots to think about there. We have drinks around the corner. Can't remember which room. Atmosphere room. So if you just want an informal conversation or just have a drink on a Friday, just come and join us around the corner. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.